Okay, so we're going to kind of pick up where we left off. We were talking about stature variation. Stature is basically anything that has to do with how big you are. So stature can be height. It can also be weight. It can be kind of overall size, like width, and he's stocky. She's tall. These kinds of things. So that is fundamentally what stature variation is. And as we saw in the last slide of the last show, we were talking about the fact that the next generation, although it kind of goes against what we normally think about, but the next generation in that family, that immigrant family of Irish or Italian descent, um, were likely going to be much shorter than their predecessors, their parents and grandparents. The reason being, of course, because they're not getting enough nutrition to grow to their full potential. So we talked a little bit about Harris lines and things like enamel hypoplasias that would help play into that. Okay, Allen's rule is a biological rule given to us in 1877 by Allen. According to him, endotherms from colder climates usually have shorter legs and limbs. What is it? First of all, what is an endotherm? Endotherm, simply put, is a warm-blooded animal. That is like you or me or birds or bats or really any mammal and birds. Endotherms from colder areas tend to have shorter arms and legs. That's what they're saying. So the way that we use this and the next rule coming up, which is Bergmans Rule, in anthropology is kind of bastardized a little bit. To simplify, especially for students who are new to hearing about these things, and most of you haven't really heard about this before, the simple way to look at it is Allen's rule means tall and thin. These are generally warm climate adapted animals or humans. So what we're doing really is conflating both Allen's rule and Bergman's rule, but this makes it fairly easy to remember. Also, look at the word Allen. If you look up here at Allen's rule, A and L, those are all really tall, skinny letters. So you can think of Allen's rule being tall and thin. By the way, these don't have to do with fat, so we'll talk about that later. But Allen's rule is tall and thin, and that is associated with warm climate adaptation. So where do you find that in the world? Well, you're going to find that in the equatorial regions. You're going to see, along with that warm adapted, tall, thin body, is also usually the high UV darker skin. But don't get confused. Don't think that if they live in a cold climate, they cannot have darker skin, because that's not the case at all. We'll see how that works in a minute. So, well, in a few minutes. So Allen's rule, remember, tall and thin, like these letters A and L. Conversely, Bergman's rule is saying that within a species, the body mass increases with latitude and therefore colder climates. So in a colder climate now, we're going to see a wider, bigger, heavier body. But keep in mind, this does not mean fat. This means stocky, shorter bodies. So we're sort of conflating Allen's rule and Bergman's rule. Allen's rule has everything to do with just limbs, arms and legs. Bergman's rule has to do with the central body mass. But the way I want you to remember these, the way that it makes it easy to remember, is Allen's rule, tall and thin. Bergman's rule, short and stocky. Those short arms and legs and that big, wide, stocky body. And again, if we look at the word Bergman, look at this, a B, an E, and G, and R's and M's. These are short letters, short, wide letters. So Bergman's rule, short and stocky. Allen's rule, tall and thin. Allen's rule, warm weather adapted. Bergman's rule, cold climate adaptation. So cold climate, Bergman's rule, warm climate, Allen's rule. Make sense? Okay, moving on. I'm going to show you guys a chart of This is a chart of pretty much latitude along the x-axis here, and the y-axis we have body breadth. And what we're looking at is by iliac breadth. What that really means is the width between the hips. So really that's a good measure of their body width. You can see this gentleman up here, much thicker and stockier and shorter. This person tall and thin. And here we see, if you look at the lines of latitude, where in latitude is 0 degrees latitude? It's the equator. Way up here at 80 degrees latitude, really there aren't any humans that live that far up, but keep in mind, toward 90 degrees latitude, both north and south, is away from the equator. And what we're looking at is colder areas, generally. So what we'll see is short, stocky people up toward the poles, and near the equator, taller, thinner people. Allen's rule here, Bergmans rule up here. Hopefully that makes sense. And undoubtedly, you have a few ideas of places around the world that don't fit in with this. And in my live class, I have a lot of stories that I talk about why those things are. But let me just talk about a couple to clarify and help you deal with these kind of misconceptions in a way. Allen's rule and Bergmans rule deals with purely climate adaptation. It has nothing to do with culture. So let me tell you how, and we've learned a lot about bioculture already. We've learned that different foods will give us fatter people or thinner people. But that doesn't have anything to do with Bergman and Allen's rule. Bergman's rule is saying they're stocky, thick, wide, short bodies, not fat. So if you think about it, things like people tend to think of the Nords, the Scandinavians, people like Swedes and Norwegians as big people, tall people. And not necessarily not stocky. What's going on? Well, something happened around about 1000 AD and a little bit before and a little bit after. They were Vikings. This is a biocultural event because when they're going Viking, which is what they called it, you're going around to conquer and pillage and fight. And you're not fighting with guns. You have to be big to fight well in that era. So this is hand-to-hand, smashing each other over the heads with axes and swords. So what's going on here? Well, who are you going to follow? Who's going to be the one who's a successful Viking? The big guy or the little guy? You're going to follow the bigger guy. And when that big guy becomes successful, who's he going to start looking for a wife? Big women. And what do they have? Big babies. They want big. Because big is a huge cultural thing. Here's another one that comes up often, ostensibly breaking this rule. The Polynesians. Think about the Polynesian islands. These are big people too, aren't they? The most dramatic of them is Samoa. Find a small Samoan. The Rock is a small Samoan. He's a big guy. Point is, same thing. We're looking at a cultural shift. The Samoan culture, in fact, most of the Polynesian culture, believes big people literally have big life energy. They call it mana. Actually, that's the kind of anglicized equivalent of it. But this mana, this life force, is so powerful that if a big person touches a little person, that little person could die. It's like Raiders of the Lost Ark. If they touch this amount of power, you can't handle it and you will die because your body is too small and frail to deal with. Well, who's going to become the big chief? Literally big people. And what's big chief going to look for in a wife? Big women. And they have big babies. And that's the point. Furthermore, they can handle that in those areas because they are not going without food, are they? The Pacific Islanders literally have fruit falling out of the trees that is delicious. They have coconuts falling out of the trees that are delicious. They've got a sea filled with fish. They literally never went without. You could hunt and gather on the Polynesian Islands and sustain a big population of big people without ever running out of food. And that culture enables that to happen. So yeah, these cultures break these rules, but only because of their cultural implications and how they had to deal with living in that area. Also, there's nothing in those cases, there's nothing physically killing off people who don't fall into these things. Whereas if you look at groups like the Inuit or the Eskimo, are those cold areas that's way up in Alaska and Greenland and the top edge of Canada? Is it cold up there? You bet. And what do you find? You find short, stocky people. They're not fat, but they've got big, wide, thick bodies because they're trying to keep that heat in. It's all about thermoregulation. That is how we deal with temperature, how our bodies either shed extra heat or retain heat in the cold. And you can bet in those areas, in Alaska, northern Canada, is it cold up there? Yes. Is it deadly if you don't have this adaptation? You bet it is. So what happens to the people who don't adapt, who don't fall into this category? They die. They die from exposure. They cannot get warm. Conversely, down at the other end, way down here toward our 0 degrees latitude, really in the tropics below 20 degrees, what do we see? We see these tall, thin bodies. For what reason? They're shedding the extra heat. They have to do that because if they didn't, they would literally die. You overheat, you get heat stroke, and die. So that's the difference here of what we're looking at. We're looking at the natural adaptation and the cultural, which can sometimes override some of those adaptations if the culture doesn't have to deal with these deadly environments on either end of the spectrum. So from there, we see a lot of variation. If only Disney had a way of helping us memorize Bergman and Allen's rules. And again, I apologize, Disney likes drawing them fat, but we don't mean Bergman's rule is fat, do we? We mean thick and stocky, but what am I going to do? Cruella de Vil didn't have any henchmen that were thick and stocky. Instead, he's kind of what we would call stocky these days, but really he looks more fat. But I want you to think of Allen's rule as tall and thin, and Bergman's rule as short and stocky. Hopefully this sinks in pretty well. Okay, here we're looking at a map of the world with specific areas highlighted in red. You can probably figure out that those specific areas that are highlighted in red are mountain ranges. And the mountain ranges in these areas change the rules quite a bit. This is another marginal area. That is, an area that's hard to live in, hard to make a living in. Well, these areas have several factors that make them very difficult to live in. Before, with Bergman and Allen's rule, we're talking about thermoregulation. That is, dealing with body heat, trying to keep body heat in or trying to let body heat out in order to deal with the ambient temperatures. But in the mountain ranges, although at the top of these mountain ranges, they do tend to be very cold, so you'll see most of these populations follow very closely with Bergman's rule, the short, stocky bodies. But there's more going on in these areas. If we zoom in to this area here, if you guys look right here in kind of the Asian/Indian supercontinent, right where they're bashing together, the Indian continent is driving up into the Asian continent and forcing this massive uplift, which gives us the biggest mountains in the world. You probably know this mountain range is called the Himalayas. And the largest mountain up there Everest. So let's look at Mount Everest and how that deals with these adaptations that are so important. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Mount Everest just for a few minutes. First of all, if we look at tourists going up Mount Everest, here we see a pair of tourists. They're clearly cold. They're wearing their parkas inside their sleeping bags, inside their tent. But furthermore, if you look at what's slapped on their face there, that is oxygen. Oxygen masks. Why? Well, they say at high altitude, specifically, well, above 25,000 feet, it is literally called the death zone, meaning nobody lives above 25,000 feet. And if you are spending time above that height, your body, your tissues in your body are not getting enough oxygen, therefore they are slowly dying. So you can only live for a matter of really not very long in the death zone. Furthermore, considering how much energy it takes and everything else, it will kill you if you're hiking up there within a day usually. Sometimes it takes 2 to 3. Um, so the bottled oxygen is an effort to ameliorate that, to slow it down a little bit. And what that does is it doesn't give necessarily the body, how to explain oxygen masks at height. Basically, the hemoglobin in your blood cannot bond to oxygen molecule very well because the pressure is too low at that height. So what you're trying to do is flood your lungs with oxygen molecules. Therefore, the hemoglobin kind of picks up a few of them regardless. To be honest, rebreathers would probably be more effective at that level, but why no? So hypoxia is what's going on here. And hypoxia comes with it a lot of very negative effects, which for tourists like this, the negative effects will be felt at much lower altitudes than that 25,000 feet. In fact, tourists can feel it at 2,000 feet or even 1,000 feet by some people above sea level. They start to have difficulty. The difficulty is driven by our inability to efficiently move that oxygen around and get it to the cells of our bodies. So what starts to happen? A lot of things. First of all, you get headaches, and then you get, of course, shortness of breath and vomiting, nausea. You can have problems with vision, and then all of this is, of course, exacerbated by the cold. So you start having issues like frostbite and other things that can severely hurt your body or kill you in and of itself. As you know, with frostbite, it can get gangrenous and you can go septic and die. So hypoxia is a very serious thing. And it is a very real malady. If any of you have ever been to somewhere like Machu Picchu in Peru or any of these areas that are relatively high up, you'll start feeling the effects. In fact, some of you may have even felt it in the mountains here in California. The United States' tallest mountain is here in California, a little bit north of us. And if you go up there, you may feel very nauseous if you go up for a ski trip or something like that. Those are the early effects of hypoxia. So now we've looked at how tourists go up Mount Everest with all of their help. Let's look at how locals go up Mount Everest. These are locals on Mount Everest. And if you look, his head is somewhere around here, but these are 55-gallon drums on these individuals. This is heavy stuff. And they're able to move it quite well through these really difficult terrain. So what do we expect to see? Well, we know it's cold, so we would expect to see Bergmans Rule. And sure enough, we do. Their thermoregulation is trying to deal with those cold weather environments. So we see short, stocky bodies. But again, going back to does Bergman's rule mean fat? No, it doesn't. You know these people do not have an ounce of fat on them. They're quite burly. They're short. They've got short arms and legs trying to pull those extremities in toward the center of mass, trying to get that warmth in as small an area, as compact an area as they can. Furthermore, what do we expect to see inside their bodies? If it's a low oxygen area, What do you expect to see in the lungs? Bigger or smaller? Of course, they're much larger because, again, the lungs are trying to do what the bottled oxygen for the tourist is doing. That is, bring in as much oxygen as you can so that the hemoglobin can bond to that, even in these low pressure environments. Furthermore, how does that blood then get pumped around the body? The heart. So would we expect to see large or small hearts on these people? Large, big hearts. Aw, they have big hearts. Of course they do. Look at all this tourist crap they're carrying up for people. I mean, granted, it's their job, but still, that's a lot of work. And then they're not even done. Once they carry all this up to the camp, then they set it up for the tourists who eventually get themselves up there. So the hypoxic environment is affecting these bodies a lot less because these people have been living here for centuries, generations upon generations have been living here. And what do you see? You see the populations start to adapt to that environment. And sure enough, we see larger lungs, larger heart. We call this a larger vital capacity of these individuals, which makes a lot of sense. That's not the only difference we're going to see up high in the Himalayas. Again, this is a word of caution to not conflate dark skin with warm areas. It has nothing to do with thermoregulation. It has everything to do with dealing with too much ultraviolet. So, are they getting a lot of UV rays up high in the mountains? You bet, for two reasons, actually. The first reason is literally they are closer to the top of the atmosphere. So what you have there is you've got not as much UV is being filtered out. But then there's the rest of it. If you look at the background of this picture, you see glaciers, ice, snow. That causes a massive amount of reflective light as well. So you can imagine these people are getting, you've probably heard of snow blindness, haven't you? Especially with tourists going up Mount Everest, they all wear those big giant sunglasses, right? What causes snow blindness? It's not the temporary, oh my God, it's bright in here, I can't see a thing. Snow blindness is actually a sunburn on the cornea of your eye. A sunburn. And it can blister and it can indeed cause blindness if it's let go bad enough. Which is another effect. So first of all, we see the darker skin. The other thing that we see, and this is not very well talked about or understood as to how this exactly works, but the epicanthic fold. Epi meaning above, canthic meaning the eyelid. What we're looking at is that folded eyelid that we associate with Asiatic groups around the world. That may be a protection against sunlight, too much bright. So we see the epicanthic fold happening all around the world, actually, in places where people have been living in a very bright environment. For example, we see that in seafaring areas, like the islanders, the Pacific Islanders are all Asiatic. They have that very clear epicanthic fold, but even in non-Asiatic cultures around the world. For example, in Iceland and Greenland, although the indigenous people who live in Greenland are naturally Asiatic. But even people who live there, who move there later, tend to have this epicanthic fold. We see it to a lesser degree in Finland, Sweden, all of these areas that have a lot of snow and a lot of bright light. We tend to see this epicanthic fold. This may be a stretch, but if any of you remember the singer to the Sugar Cubes, Bjork, she then went off and had a solo career. Bjork is Icelandic, and she does indeed have the epicanthic folds. You'll see this in a lot of people. Now that you're looking for it, you'll see it to a greater or lesser extent. People of some of these areas tend to have this feature, and it may be associated with bright light. It also may be something we call a secondary or even tertiary subsidiary of a different genetic change. It may be associated with other things, but we're not sure. Okay, so now that we've gone through Bergman and Allen's rules and all these other things, what else can affect the size of an individual's body? Well, some of these things are pretty obvious, and some of them may not be. First of all, this is a difficult picture to look at, but this is an individual who was starving during the famine that was caused by two things, really, in Ethiopia in the 1980s. It was caused by, first of all, a drought that went on for a long time, and secondly, by warlords kind of fighting over who has access to things, and the people invariably suffered. But obviously, starvation will tend to cause people having smaller bodies. This individual, if he survives, will not grow up to be his full possible size. Again, we'll start to see things like Harris lines in his bones and the enamel hypoplasias if this struck him early enough in life to affect his teeth. But keep in mind, starvation doesn't always mean the same thing as malnutrition. Malnutrition, you can eat plenty of food and still be malnourished. For example, if you're sitting in your basement, in your mom's basement, playing video games all day, drinking Coke or Diet Coke seems to be the thing, and or Mountain Dew or whatever, and eating bonbons all day, you're not going to be cheesy poofs. You're not going to be you're not going to be getting proper nutrition. So keep that in mind. Malnutrition doesn't always mean starvation, although they usually go hand in hand. This is another graph which I both hate and love, as usual. Me and graphs, I don't know. I can never find the perfect graph, and I don't feel like making them myself. But there's a couple problems with this graph, and we'll associate those or assess them when we come to them. But first of all, what we have are the blue line are boys, the red line are girls. These are children of various ages okay, this is in Europe. We can see the years down across the bottom. We're talking 1910 through 1960. And they've got War I and War II. Of course, they mean World War I and World War II. There's a couple problems with the graph itself, too, and we'll talk about that in a minute. What we are looking at is during wartime, in the area where the war is happening, people tend to go without. How come? Well, think about if you have an agricultural industry. Where are the wars being fought, or the battles being fought? Traditionally, they were fought on the farmland. Nowadays, they're kind of fought everywhere, but traditionally, farmland. Furthermore, who's doing the fighting? Young men, right? Those are traditionally the farmers. So what you have here is not only are the farmlands themselves being blown to pieces and everybody's shooting at each other on them, but also the people who would normally be tending the farm are doing the shooting. So you're not going to have the surplus that you would normally have year to year. As a result, again, who suffers? Always the populace. In war, it's always the civilians that suffer the worst. Because all of the good food, all of the world goods, all of the stuff that you need for living normally goes toward the front line in the war effort. So as a result, you end up with malnutrition at best, starvation at worst, of these kids. So what you see, of course, in the stature, what we're looking at on our vertical axis here is the height in centimeters. Keep in mind, 150 centimeters is just about 5 foot, 5'6", 5'5", somewhere in there. Maybe a little shorter than that even. And we're seeing these kids dropping pretty low. Whereas as they get a little later on and get out of this war slump, we see that it recovers over time, and eventually they kind of keep climbing along the normal rate that they would have been going otherwise. So we see these pretty dramatic shifts and these downturns in each one of our groups. When they started taking this data, we can see it drops pretty dramatically. This drop is much lower than where we were normally at. Our trajectory was going this way, and then we have this huge slump here. Then it's going just great, and then whoomph, drops way off again in the middle of the war. Has a brief respite and then drops off again, then starts climbing again. One of the problems with this is right in here. What they failed to account for in putting this together was puberty. So we're seeing girls especially hitting puberty and the boys hitting it to a lesser degree. So we see this is not accounted for in the 12 to 13 range, which at first, early on, didn't affect them so much. That has more to do with nutrition and some other things that we will talk about later. Okay. This is another one of my wonderful, I love to do this, but unfortunately, in my live classes, this is a lot more dynamic. Again, this is another photograph that we're going to discuss, or at least I wish we could. In this photograph, we've got actually three people sitting on a bench. We've got Blue, Tommy, and Ronald. I'll leave it to you to figure out who's who. So we're going to talk about Tommy and Blue because Ronald doesn't change all that much. There are a few background things I want to tell you about these two, and it really plays a huge part into how we're looking at these things. The first thing that surprises a lot of people is Tommy and Blue are the same age. Tommy and Blue are the same age. They live in the same place. This place is India. So Tommy, by the way, yes, there are McDonald's in India. No, they don't serve cow burgers, but now we're starting to get more savvy. We realize you can make burgers out of a lot of things. They sort of started the bean burger, but they also have chicken and everything else. And it is just as unhealthy and just as sort of what it is as it is here in the United States. The ingredients don't change all that much aside from the fact that there's no beef in India. Well, first of all, let me throw this out to you. Let's discuss Ron a little bit. Ronald McDonald. Is that high or low quality food? High or low quality food? Instantly, everybody assumes it is low quality food because we call it junk food, don't we? So is McDonald's junk food? Yes. Is it high or low quality food? It is actually very high quality food. Why do we call this high quality food? Well, in anthropology, the way we look at the quality of food is how nutrient dense it is. That means how many calories does it have? Believe it or not, in a survival situation, calories are a good thing, despite what Weight Watchers has been trying to teach us over the past few decades. Calories are good. They literally mean energy. It's how you get energy. So calories are good. Salt, believe it or not, pretty good. If you guys remember our discussion with the salt shaker's curse, we know salt is used to retain water. It is also used in the body to do a lot of other things. We need a certain amount of salt. But of course, McDonald's has way too much. Next, fat. We need a certain amount of fat. McDonald's has way too much. Next, sugars. We need a certain amount of sugars. McDonald's has way too much. You're starting to get the idea here. There's too much of everything in a McDonald's burger because we crave those things. And you can bet that the reason we crave them is because historically we need them. And now we're getting a little too much of them in these things. So now let's think about India a little bit. Aside from the fact that they don't eat beef, which really has no bearing in this particular exercise anyway. Tommy and Blue, same age. Tommy and Blue, same activity level. They're both on the same soccer team. They live in the same place. They go to the same school. Okay. This is another one of those biocultural things that we've been talking about, and I told you would kind of carry through this entire thing. We talked about bioculture when we were talking about stature earlier with the Samoans and the Vikings. But now, how is their stature affected by their culture? Well, clearly, Tommy and Blue eating the same amount of the same thing, doing the same activity levels, and are the same age group, clearly affecting their bodies very differently. Why? Well, the truth is, India is a very ancient culture. They've been around for thousands of years. The vast majority of that time, they had a pretty major discipline in place. It was a cultural discipline, culturally dictated discipline. That is the caste system. You've probably heard of the caste system. For those of you who have not, it's C-A-S-T-E, caste. And what it is a non-mobile. In other words, you can't marry into a different caste. You can't marry out of a caste. You're born into it and you die in it. Whatever caste you're in defines what hierarchical level you are at in society. Sounds pretty harsh. If you're born into a low caste, the extremely low caste were literally called the untouchables. They were the filthy, the horrible. They were treated very, very poorly. They often starved. In fact, they usually didn't have more than a couple of meals a day, or a week sometimes, or at all sometimes. Then it went all the way up to the ruling caste, and they stayed that way. The question is, why did they do this? And why was it seen as, I don't know, fair to do that? Well, it's all based on part of the basis of their religion at the time was karma. That term karma, we use it all wrong nowadays because of the Beatles. It tells us about instant karma. So when you're driving down the street, down the highway, somebody cuts you off, and then they turn off, and they're flipping you off and being a jerk, and then they smash into the car in front of them, and you laugh to yourself, and you go, ha, karma, jerk. Keep driving to work, right? Well, in fact, that's not how karma is really supposed to work. That is the Beatles version of instant karma. In fact, karma is dependent on how you live your life. And then reincarnation, in other words, you come back into another life after you've lived one life. You die, and then you're born again into another life. Well, that born again is the key here. If you were a good person, karmically, in your previous life, you will be born into a higher caste. If you are a horrible person in your previous life, you are born into a lower caste. Okay. So, with all of that information, it's time to play detective. And if you really want to play it and I go too fast, you feel free to pause it until you figure this out. But who is from a traditional... Oh, by the way, the caste system is virtually defunct now. They don't abide by it very much anymore. In fact, if anything, it's kind of a social thing more than anything else. It's certainly not associated with the jobs that are available to you or how much money you can get or whether or not you can live in a certain place or anything like that anymore. Thankfully, that has gone by the wayside. But we're going to talk a little bit about caste in the sense that how has it affected in a biocultural way Tommy's body and Blue's body. Which one of these two, here's the big question, which one of these two come from a higher caste, Tommy or Blue? And why do you think so? If you really want to ponder this for a while, hit pause now. Okay. Blue is from the higher caste. How come? Well, think about the salt shaker's curse and those lessons that we learned. If Tommy is from a lower caste, then historically, was his family getting enough to eat? No. So the people who survived those lean years, so to speak, were the ones whose bodies tended to hang on to nutrients, almost exactly like the salt shaker's curse. If they were starving, the people who survive are the people whose bodies hang on with both hands to calories, to nutrients that would otherwise just go right through their body. Conversely, if you're from a higher caste, you knew you were going to get food again. You knew you were in a position where you were going to get 3 meals a day, likely. And if that was the case, does your body, in order to survive, hang on as tenaciously to those nutrients? No. Your body can let those nutrients go because you know there's going to be more later, and you'll survive it. Therefore, Tommy's family is from a lower caste historically, and you can see it has had an effect this many years down the line, this many centuries down the line. It's had an effect on now they're eating the same thing, doing the same thing, living essentially parallel lives, and yet it's affecting Tommy's body much differently than Blue's body. Bioculture. Okay. Now we're going to talk a little side shoot here into occupational bone modification or remodeling. Occupational. First of all, let's talk about that word occupation. What's our occupation? A lot of people associate occupation with your job. Sorry, I had to take a swig. Truth is, occupation really means what you do all day. So by that, when we're looking at bones, we're looking at what we do with our bodies all day. Look at us. We're Americans. What do we do all day with our bodies? Man, we sit. We sit. We get up. We wake up in the morning. First thing in the morning. Oh, get out of bed. Whew, good night's sleep. You go out. You do your morning routine, and you go in and you sit down and have breakfast. Then we get up. Oh, good breakfast there. And you go brush teeth, get yourself already set to go to work, and then we go out or wherever we're going. Go out and sit in the car and drive wherever we're going. Then we get there. Whew, that was a tough commute. We get to our work, and then we sit down in front of the computer or wherever we're working and sit all day. Now, if you're a nurse, this doesn't count. You're on your feet all day, and you're amazing. But everybody else, we sit. We sit all the time. That's literally our occupation. If you were to read our bones as 21st century Americans, we're sitters. Because then after a long day at work, you get back into your car and you sit the whole way home. And then you get home and, whew, I'm tired. I had a long day at work. I better sit down and watch TV. Sit down and have dinner, then go to bed and start it all over again. We're sitters. Okay, so what we do with our bodies and what we've done with our bodies throughout our lives can modify our bones. And if we change what we do with our bodies, it can change our bones to some degree. And I'll talk a lot more about that in the next unit. When we get into Unit 2, we're going to talk... Oh, no, this is Unit 2. Sorry. We'll talk about that in 2, maybe 3 lectures from now. We'll talk about that. That'll happen. Over time, there we go. Over time, you guys can see there's this dip in the skull. That's actually also, because we're not very inventive in science sometimes, that's also called a tump line that we find in the skull, but it shows us that they used a tump line throughout their lives. But you can see this has modified this person's skull over time. This isn't because it got smushed or broken or crunched or anything like that. This is actually a very natural process, which we will talk about later on. But the body's ability to change and shift. Bone is a very dynamic tissue, which we'll talk about ad nauseum in a few lectures from now. But because it is so dynamic, it moves and changes throughout our lives, more so than most people think. So we'll see these bony modifications. Keep doing that. Lost somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 400 men. Meanwhile, the French knights, who thought they had a run through with this one, lost almost up to between 6 and 12,000 of them lost their lives. A further about 3,000 were taken prisoner, somewhere between 2 and 3,000, depending on who you ask. Point is, it was a blowout. And the reason? Because of this new weapon that's really cheap to equip. Crazy stuff. But the bony modification that we see in these men, because they were doing this their whole lives, is pretty drastic. So the big question is, can you think of any other groups of people in modern day that would fall into this occupational bone remodeling? That would be an occupation that they start from an early age, like around the age of 4 or 5 years old, maybe into 6, 7, 8, 10 years old, and they carry through for their entire adult life. First thought that most of you are probably going to have are athletes. And when you look at athletes, we can see a lot of bone remodeling. For example, like this woman playing tennis. Athletes who use one side of their body more so than the other tend to show it in the size of their bones. So a right-handed pitcher, for example, will have a larger pitching arm. Or somebody who is an arm wrestler, someone playing tennis, someone, in some cases, basketball, things like that. Whereas in other sports that are a little bit more kind of symmetrical in the way they use the body, we will see the bones themselves getting thicker all the way around. But we won't see this sort of one-sidedness like we do in people who are playing, for example, a hockey forward who plays most of the time one hand forward, a fencer, those kinds of things. So how to see these differences? Well, this is a cross section. The humerus is the upper arm bone, the bone between your shoulder and elbow. That upper arm bone, if we cut it in half and look at it like we're looking at a straw, lengthwise down the middle, we're looking at the cut off bone, cut in half here. And if you notice, in somebody who is right-handed, who has a predominantly right hand only use of that bone, we will see this thickening of the bone on the inside and on the outside. So the medullary cavity, which you'll learn about in a couple of talks from now, is narrower, but more importantly, the outer bone shaft is much thicker than what we see in the obverse hand, the opposite hand. So what we see is this one-sided, one-armed thing, pretty common, even in people who are not athletes, if you are right-handed or left-handed. If we really look closely, we can sometimes see the difference, depending on how active you are. We're going to be talking a lot more about bones in really a couple of episodes from now, but for now, know that bone keeps changing, and it changes throughout our lives depending on what we're doing with it. And that's really important to keep in mind.